And I'm with the fabulous Rashaad Newsome. The last time I met you, Rashaad, was in your studio, what, 2 years ago?
2 years ago, yeah, with
And
David Grin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Rashaad's work really kind of hit a chord with me because I am, despite the way I look, a child of hip hop. And I must confess, Rashaad, when I first saw your work, I saw the collages and the bling and the stuff. I didn't quite understand it at first, you know, but it really seduces you in. And when I've done some research on you, the amount of research that you've done and the way that you've managed to bring different worlds together is really quite impressive. We'll talk about that as we go through the talk. Okay. I won't introduce Rashaad straight away. I think I'd like to introduce him through the work, and we'll see some clips of the work and then talk about them and how they developed. But first, Rashaad, I want to ask you the question that all artists hate, which is, you know, your background, your biography, where you're from. But I think the fact that you're from New Orleans, you live in New York.
I live in New York, yeah.
But you're from New Orleans. I've never been to New Orleans, but of course New Orleans has this incredible history of, you know, jazz, music, fusion, French culture, all kinds of mixtures. And I think that comes through all of your work. So tell us a little bit, let's start off a little bit about your background, because you also studied in New Orleans. You studied art history.
Art history.
So tell us a little bit about your background in New Orleans and also your study of art history, because that's really influenced your development as an artist.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that you asked that, because recently I had my first solo exhibition in New Orleans at the New Orleans Museum of Art, and it was part of a series called the Great Hall series, where artists are asked to engage the landscape that of New Orleans. And it was kind of funny, when I left New Orleans really frustrated, and I was kind of like, you know, I can't do anything here. You know, you hit the glass ceiling, and like there just wasn't a lot of opportunities for artists. But post Katrina and post the biennial and everything, things have really changed a lot. And going back and working on that show and spending time there, I kind of saw the city with new eyes and rediscovered it, and saw how heavily influenced my work, was by that city. And I think, well, anyway, I'm from there, born and raised. I studied art history at Tulane University. My father is a musician.
So you have music in the blood?
Yeah, my earliest performative gestures were performing with my father. Me and my brother used to have to sing with him. We would sing backup for him and get paid with McDonald's. So, but yeah, I think the work is heavily influenced by New Orleans in terms of, New Orleans has such a rich street performance culture, and I think that really is something that has inspired me. I think within my collage work, in terms of my attention to color and detail and craft, if you will, comes from, you know, just spending a lot of time in the Treme with a lot of the Mardi Gras Indian chiefs. It's also the birthplace of jazz. Absolutely. And jazz came from the brass band, and you know, a lot of the concepts behind my performance work is sort of composing improvisation, and improvisation is one of the key components of jazz. So I think that's also a heavy influence.
Okay, I want to start off perhaps as a way into your work by looking at an early work which is kind of evolved, called shade compositions. And that in a way encompasses much of the work that you are interested in. Yeah. And I guess at the base of the work is this kind of interest in the gestural language of African American women in particular as a starting point. Yeah. And how that translates into other contexts and other cultures. And it starts off with a series of kind of performative works, and then really expands in a really incredible way, and a very complex way. And I think we'd maybe look at the first clip to have a look at some of the early work on shade compositions. Okay. So Rashaad, can you tell us, what are we seeing here?
So, when I started the piece, it came out of an interest in, maybe I should let this play, yeah?
Okay.
So the piece came out of an interest in the sassy gesticulations associated with black females. And
Yeah.
I was really interested in that particular vernacular because it's something that I grew up around, but it was also something that I understood as being something ghetto or being used by
Yeah.
people of a lower class. And so that immediately made me want to work with it because it was so complex in that way. And I didn't like the idea of, although it is a stereotypical body language associated with that group, it's a stereotype for a reason. And I didn't like the idea. I was thinking like, who decided that was in an inappropriate way to
Right.
communicate? And I didn't like the idea of someone else dictating what was appropriate for me to communicate.
Yeah.
So it started out as just kind of doing what I called screen tests, and was sort of like my own ethnographic research of that body language. And it started out in the US, and then I went to Europe, and I was doing some residencies over there. So the screen test would literally just be I would find local women, and I started with women because I felt like that was like the beginning for me of where it came from.
Yeah.
So they would stand against the wall and perform like a set amount of gestures, and then I would ask them to give me some that they do or their family members do. And I had been sort of like building this library of gestures.
Like an archive of gestural movements. Right?
Yeah. And what was really important when I was abroad was I wanted to see, if these things had, to me, culture is something that lacks fixed boundaries. So I wanted to see how that translated in another part of the world. And what was interesting was when I was in France, I went to Barbès, and I found like several women who were,
Barbès is like an area of Paris where there's a high immigrant and African population.
Yeah. And what was interesting was those ladies were from continental Africa, and this was something that was perceived to be stereotypical gesture of African American females, but they did it eerily similar to the girls in New York.
Right.
And so it sort of brought up this whole question of ownership. Also in my research, I realized what is considered to be the stereotypical body language of African American females is also the stereotypical body language of gay males globally. Like if you think about the stereotypical queen, it's always like, this kind of,
I always wanted to do that, by the way. I haven't got it quite down, but I was practicing earlier. Yeah.
So, so that kind of, that was also a part of the research. And so it took the form of a performance, and the early performance was first done in Paris, and it was 5 ladies who stood in the space, and each one was given a gesture, and they would perform it consecutively, and they would just continue to do that.
Have we got that clip?
Yeah.
Let's have a look at that now.
That's it, yeah.
This is in the Glass Box Art Gallery in Paris.
Yes.
One of the things that interests me about this as well is there's a very strong percussive element.
There is sound, but I think there's I guess the computer may be moving slow, but should we stop it?
Okay, maybe stop that one.
So, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, we'll see another clip where there's a strong percussive element, which I think you were quite influenced by Steve Reich's drumming.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that and how that came into the work?
Well, when I started the performance, I had saw the Steve Reich drumming piece, and I was thinking about how he used phasing, which is actually he came to by way of going and spending time in Ghana with like drummers there.
Exactly.
And I like the idea of through sonic repetition that you could create like a complex composition. So I wanted to kind of like build on that, but obviously not with instruments, with actual live sounds.
Right.
And so I did the performance, and then when I got back to New York, I was looking at the rehearsal footage, and then I ended up cutting that into a video, and just to sort of bring out more the sound that I was kind of hearing in the rehearsal. It was kind of like this loose rhythm, but it wasn't really refined, and I wanted to really kind of, I don't know, just refine that. So it turned into a video, but I didn't want it to be like a video quartet. So I wanted it to stay as a live art piece. And after I made that video, at the time I was doing a residency at Harvest Works Digital Media Arts Center.
Right.
And I was studying a programming language called Maximus P and Jitter. And also the Nintendo Wii came out. And in some of my other work, I was kind of emerging as a composer or conductor, if you will. And so I really just kind of like completely took on that role. And those tools that I had discovered, I was able to use to do what I was doing in post live. The Wii was a Bluetooth device, so I was able to connect it to the computer, and then using the programming language, I was able to write code to make it function sort of like a guitar effects pedal.
Right.
So they would be able to make the sound, I can record it, loop it, and play it back, and make more complex compositions, and to basically do what I was doing in post, but in real time.
Sure. Because at this point, you bring yourself into the performance as a conductor.
Yeah.
With the Wii, looping back and forth in real time.
Yeah.
So you yourself are engaging with the performers and in a way organizing them in space and time. Should we have a look at this?
This was the video that was cut together to make a composition.
There's also a kind of machinic quality. It's almost like a machine.
Yeah.
It's almost like, I mean, the link with minimalism there with Steve Reich, but it's kind of this regular kind of, almost industrial.
Yeah, that's something I'm always looking
aesthetic.
for. It's like one of my favorite moments of the piece is, because making this piece is so much fun because, you know, you go, and it really kind of becomes a collaboration because I go there and I do the screen test wherever I am. It's always site specific.
Yeah.
And so there is a set of sounds that are always used because I am making a beat. So I need a kick, I need an 808, I need a hi-hat, I need, you know, certain melodies. So like the snap and the are always used for that reason. But during the screen test, I always ask the performers to give me gestures that they do or family members do, and then that material becomes a part of the composition, making it site-specific.
So you took this piece to Moscow as well, right?
Yeah.
And you did it with a group of Russian women. How did the piece change in a different context? And were the performers aware of that kind of African American gestural language? How did they did you coach them? How did it work?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't tell them, oh, you have to do it this way. What I need is them to be able to do the sound, do it on time. So, you know, you have to be in sync with your group, you have to be watching me for your cues, and you have to create a narrative around this one gesture multiple times.
Yeah.
So whatever that narrative is up to them. But what's interesting is when I went to Moscow, these girls didn't really know my work at all or anything like that. So when I was doing the screen test, I would give them the gesture and they would immediately perform it like the girls in New York. So to me, it kind of revealed some kind of truth that, you know, this type of vernacular had kind of, to me, became sort of like an open source for people to present themselves from a
Black
position of
culture,
power.
in a way, is an open source, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of global now.
Yeah, and I would say black culture is one of the biggest American exports.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So that was kind of interesting, but at the same time, it made me think about authenticity. And I had a conversation with someone one time, and I was like, oh, well, they're just, you know, performing. But I met the girls and spent time with them and worked with them, and, you know, who's to say that if you're in this part of the world and you watch the internet and movies and videos and TV, you can craft your own identity, and isn't that your identity? You know, like, are you performing, or is that who you are? And I felt like that was really who they were. So it kind of revealed how it's something that had kind of it was also something that they were participating in, in an authentic way, not in an unauthentic way.
Sure. Let's move on to the next clip because I'm concerned.
So yeah,
Talk us through this, Rashaad.
Yeah, this was the first time I did the performance on a large scale, and I wanted to make it more complex and play more with classical music structures. So they were separated into string, brass, woodwind, and percussion sections. But in this case, tea sucking, finger snapping, huffing and puffing sections, and they were each section is given a choreographed sound score, and I would also, record, loop, and play it back, but also
In real time.
In real time, but also move it to different parts of the house and manipulate the audio live.
So it becomes orchestral.
Yeah.
So in a way, Rashaad, you're taking a particular cultural form, taking it out of one context, putting it into a completely different context. And what are you doing? Are you validating it?
I think we should cut it.
Okay.
Oh, no, I think he can cut it now.
We'll stop that.
Can you ask me that again?
Can you stop this one? Okay. I'm just quite interested in a way what you're doing with this, because I see your work as a sense of, in a way, as a form of cultural restitution, taking kind of unheralded, forgotten, marginalized, so-called ghetto cultures, putting them into another culture, a context, orchestral, classical, and they become something else.
Yeah.
And it's a kind of a transformation.
Yeah, it's like it's almost like it's like archiving the culture and celebrating it simultaneously, making fun of it, but then also abstracting it at the same time, which is my job as an artist to do, right?
Of course.
So, and I like the idea of working with things around me, and
Sure.
I mean, that piece for me, it, a big part of it is kind of reclaiming this part of the diaspora that is scrutinized as being something ghetto. I think it's just a part of the way that we communicate, and it should be celebrated as such,
Okay.
So so that's also part of the reason the projection is there, is it's sort of like a way to shed light on how, like, the idea, the way that these gestures are perceived is like a projection onto a group of people. It's not who they are. So you get this like real-time performance and projected imagery at the same time, and they're interacting with one another. And then I'm also trying to, really just make a complex, minimalist sonic composition.
Sure. Let's move on to the next clip, because your work again evolves and becomes even more complex with the work 5. I think is this 5?
Yeah.
Let's try this one.
Oh, no, this is not 5.
Okay.
That's compositions.
This is the San Francisco.
Yes, this is the most recent performance of Shade Compositions, which is interesting because this is the first time that there were a lot of males in it. And again, it was to sort of shed light on, my research that I spoke about earlier, that what's considered to be the stereotypical gestures of Black females is also stereotypical gestures of gay males. I also wanted to, I was in San Francisco, and San Francisco has a rich gay community and gay culture and like drag culture, so I really wanted to bring that into the work.
And you also bring in color as well.
Yeah. And also what was interesting, it created a weird dynamic because it was about, it became about kind of like performing femininity too. So like the guys were performing this kind of like hyper femininity, which made the girls kind of really step their game up and perform more too. So it was interesting, so then when that started to happen, I decided to kind of like bring in a battle, and I was thinking about my other work around heraldry and battling and the work around hip hop and battling. So I choreographed some battles throughout the movements.
So there's a feedback loop between different cultures, between black women and black gay men, and how they kind of inform each other.
Yeah, and sort of like who owns it, who came first.
Right.
I mean, especially when you watch, I don't know, like a lot of reality TV and a lot of these like housewife ladies and stuff like that that are performing, but it's so funny that the way that they communicate is so eerily similar to the way gay men communicate, and I think it's because behind the scenes they're kind of manufacturing that image.
Right.
So you still kind of see them kind of coming through that character.
Yeah.
So I thought,
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Let's move on to, I'm just worried about the time, because I know we're running a bit late. Let's move on to the next clip, which I hope is 5. The reason why I think this work is interesting, Rashaad, is because it brings together the different elements of what you're interested in. So one is this kind of interest in cultural signifiers and how they evolve, the question of ownership, who owns them, how they translate into different contexts. And then also, the second element of your work, I think, which is interesting, is the kind of your interest in art history and art historical structures and how you bring them into exchange with so-called minor cultures around black culture, for example, which you wouldn't necessarily have that correlation. And then the third element, of course, is technology and how technology mediates and brings those things together in unexpected ways. Can you speak a little bit about how you managed to bring this together and why you decided to increase technology as a part of your work?
Well, with 5, the piece that's up there now, these were actually 2 videos that kind of like really influenced 5. The whole project started with me wanting to archive the language of Vogue. I was really interested in Vogue as a dance form because it was such a...
Let's explain that voguing did not start with Madonna.
It did not, yeah.
Okay. Let's get that on record. Okay.
So, I wanted to, it was a part of Black and Latino gay culture that I felt like got co-opted so early in its creation. And a lot of the people that are part of the community didn't get any rewards from that. And also I felt like it got talked about by a lot of people outside of the community, and then it was just kind of pushed aside. But the culture is something I've been involved with for a really long time, and it's the art form. I'm more interested in the dance, and the dance has really evolved a lot over the years, and it had never really been formally archived like any like ballet and so on. So it started with me going into the community and finding dancers that were very proficient in specific styles of the dance.
Sure.
And so I would invite them to my studio. Sorry. And I don't have a formal, training in choreography or dance, so I would use technology as a way to do that. So I would have the performer come to the studio, they would dance for me, I would film it, and then I would cut that into a composition that then they would go away, study, and then come back, and then we would film it. So it's like sort of using technology to choreograph.
Okay.
And then those videos would be shown as these silent portraits of the dance. And I've done 2 so far, there's more to come.
Sure.
And they act as sort of like an archive, but also like a portrait and an abstraction of those specific styles of dance. And then when I was asked to be in the biennial, Gary and Francesco asked me to propose a performance.
This is the Whitney Biennial.
Yes, the Whitney Biennial in 2010. And at the time, I was developing a software using Maxim SP and Jitter to track the motion of color in real time. And I was
as a
thinking
form of drawing.
Yeah, and I was thinking about dance, and I was thinking about action as drawing, and I was thinking about, how there's so much talk about the body and line, and I was thinking about the ephemeral nature of performance and like a new way to document it, or to make a score for it, and so, but then also I looked at it as an opportunity to really celebrate the community and employ the community. So I went in and I worked with Also, I should say, I was also really influenced by Steve Reich, well, not
Yeah.
Steve Reich, John Cage and Merce Cunningham's chance
Absolutely.
performances,
Sure.
and which kind of goes back to New Orleans, this whole like composing of improvisation. So I worked with 5 different dancers who were really proficient in one of the 5 elements that make up the most current style of Vogue, which is called Vogue Femme. And the elements that consist of that dance are hands, which is you're creating like a lot of shapes and narratives with your hands. Floor performance, which is you're doing kind of the same thing but utilizing your whole body on the floor. Catwalking, which is an elaborate catwalk. Dip spins, which is like a pirouette, and then you fall into a really dramatic drop. And then duck walking, which is pretty much kind of like walking like a duck. And there's and then there's been like a long disputed 6th element that was brought to the community by the transgender community called hair performance, which is similar to hands but using your hair.
Right.
So I worked with 5. I stuck with the 5 elements at first, and I worked with 5 different dancers and created these dance sequences based only on that element. And then in parallel, I worked with 5 musicians who played instruments that I felt mirrored what those dancers were doing visually, sonically. And that
Classical musicians?
yeah, they all weren't classical.
Okay.
Because there was a sax. I had to bring some jazz in.
Yeah.
There was
New Orleans comes back in.
Yeah, and then a little
Always.
rock and roll too. There was electric guitar, drums, flute, violin, and
And again, this performance changes according to the place where it's performed. So you
Yeah.
performed it, for example, in China,
yeah, I
in
did
Hong
in
Kong,
China. Yeah,
and using Chinese classical.
yeah, well, with China, I didn't want to just restage the piece in China. I like things to be, I'm really into creating things on site.
Right.
You know, I like the experience of that. And I was thinking that was a great opportunity for me to, instead of working with those Western instruments, work with the Eastern equivalent to them. And it was such a great experience because it changed the piece so drastically. Also, the process of making it in China, I found that musicians weren't encouraged to do improvisation.
Right.
So
That must have been a challenge.
yeah,
to-
it was really challenging because you
Yeah.
know, without them, the piece
Yeah.
can't happen. You know, I need
Yeah.
their sound. So like, I would get there and I would say, okay, so look at the dancer and say, try this riff and try that, because it's not a formal score. We create it together. You know.
By the way, you can see all of these clips on Rashaad's website and on Vimeo, rashaadnewsome.com, and I really urge you to have a look at that. Let's have a look at this clip. This is at the ICA in Boston, is that
Yeah.
right? And again, the very orchestral nature of this performance really stands out.
Oh, actually, can you go forward to when the guy in blue comes out, because this is quite long. That's
But
backwards.
Helen Molesworth
You gotta go.
talking about, yeah.
Yeah, go forward. You can just move the little dot across. Yep. All right. No, keep going. There you go. There you go. I think it's still in. I don't know. It's still fast forwarding.
Still good?
Oh,
Oh, it is?
there it goes. So this is hands.
Okay, maybe we can move on. So we're kind of going to move on a little bit. Can we play the next clip, which I hope is going to be some of your collage work? Now, Rashaad, for you, collage is something which is physical and metaphorical.
Yeah.
Why do you work with collage? Why is collage so important to your work? Because you're bringing different elements
Yeah.
into relation.
Well, I like the idea of. I started collage also when I was in Europe doing the research for shade compositions, And really how it started was I was there, I had a studio, but I wasn't working in like a formal studio practice. It was more research and video. And, but I wanted to still activate the studio, and at the time I was looking at a lot of architecture, and I became really obsessed with heraldic achievements because they were always incorporated in the architecture.
Let's explain a little bit about what heraldry is and your interest in it. Heraldry is
essentially a collage of images that represent power, rank, and position. Usually, you know, in medieval times they would use mythical creatures and things that represented power or rank. But I like the idea of this image created of images that represented rank, power, and status, and I wanted to apply that to modern times and what that would be today. So sort of taking away the lion and, you know, like for instance, a griffin is often used in the heraldry of banks because it's a keeper of wealth. In popular culture, when a guy makes his first million in his business, he buys a Rolex, or if you have a certain type of hair texture, you're perceived a certain way. If you have a certain type of car, a certain type of jewelry. So I like the idea of creating these images made from all these status symbols, and through image repetition, like shade composition, which is more of the sonic repetition, I can create texture, color, dimension.
This is Black Barbie.
Yeah.
Can you explain? Well, okay, we're looking at some of these images now. So you're kind of, what's interesting is that you have at the center of the image, the kind of where the shield would be, you have a kind of a symbol, and then you have like hands coming out, almost like tentacles.
Yeah.
Explain a little bit about the significance of that.
Well, the hands relates to another piece, the conductor, and sort of how hip hop culture is very gestural, and that was like the starting point for the piece. But also with this particular piece, it was in the show Herald that I did at Marlborough in 2011, and when I started the body of work, it was really, I started creating coats of arms from Europe but using contemporary material, and then I started to work more intuitively, and I got away from working from an original image, and then I started to look at a lot of medieval patterns and Baroque ornament, and I started to incorporate that to extend what was happening in the center of the page to the page. And then I was thinking about the history that heraldry, architecture, and ornament share, and how after the Industrial Revolution, heraldry became a part of ornament. Like, how many buildings do you see that have, you know, heraldry within the ornament, but it's not really an actual coat of arms. It's just a part of decoration. And then I like the way that that ornament is used in architecture as a framing device. So that's kind of what inspired me to incorporate the frames into the pieces.
Yeah, the frames are very sculptural, and you incorporate hip hop elements within that.
And it's not even necessarily just hip hop.
Right.
The image, I try to incorporate imagery that's in the collage into the frame. And it's interesting because some people think, oh, it's like bling and it's like all hip hop, but a lot of the imagery that I'm using sometimes comes from like Christie's and Sotheby's auction house catalogs, and a lot of that jewelry is not from rappers, it's from like, I don't know, like princesses and rich ladies in Europe and stuff. Right. So they're really like the #1 stunners, you know, way more than Birdman in some ways, you know. And I like the idea of like, you know, kind of like putting these two characters together, you know, because one would think that, you know, you would look at this guy like it's nouveau riche or in bad taste, but it's the same over here. So it's sort of kind of like putting them together. You know?
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, before I open it up to the audience, I really want to get some questions from Rashaad before we have to round up. But I guess I can't let you go without the post-black question. In some respects, post-black, I didn't really want to start with the idea of post-black, but I think it's always best to approach the question of post-black or black within art through the work itself, okay? Rather than putting a label in advance. But post-black, in a sense, emerged in the 1990s, I'm sure many of you know, coined by Glenn Ligon and Thelma Golden, artist and curator in New York, talking about how artists, a post-civil rights generation of artists in America, were interested in, were rooted in blackness, but not confined by it. Somehow wanted to complicate, even question ideas of blackness. Now, Rashaad, my question to you is, do you see yourself within that discourse? Or is that something that kind of passed you by? It's kind of a little bit dated. It was a 90s thing, and now it's not even relevant. I mean, how do you position yourself within that?
I don't think it's relevant. I'm not into it. I guess I can't help but be a part of it, right? As a black practitioner, But for me, I think that, you know, as an artist, when you make work, if you are black, if you are Latino, if you are a woman, if you are gay, you know, by default, if you're making work true to yourself, that's going to somehow come out in your work, right? So I think that by putting this label of like post-black, it's just another way to like ghettoize certain types of artists.
So ironically, post-black becomes yet another label.
Yeah.
To support
so
black
I'm kind of not
artists.
into it. You can just be an artist and making work that reflects your experience. It doesn't mean that you're post-black.
So are you beyond post-black?
I guess so. That's another label, though, right? I'm just
Okay, at
an
this
artist,
point,
right?
I'd like to, because we are running out of time. How long are we okay for questions? Okay, let's have some questions.
We have time for one question or maybe two very short
questions.
ones. And I'm sure Rashaad will be out there and you can approach him directly.
Two questions. I'm sure there are plenty of questions that people want to ask Rashaad about his work, about post-black. There's one behind you there.
Okay.
Claudia.
Can you please introduce yourself and stand up?
Hi, my name is Ellen Tani. I'm a graduate student in art history, and I love your video, The Conductor, and its engagement with the Carmina Burana. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about plans for, I know that there are supposed to be a number of videos as a part of this work.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you talk about your plans for producing those and how they'll unfold. I think I don't know how many there are out. Last I checked, there were 2.
Yeah.
And also what what kind of conversation the work stages between the hip hop video references that you used to put it together and this kind of old song that was based on a much older text.
When I started the piece, Carmina Burana is a piece that I really enjoy, and in my research of Orff, Carmina Burana is the most epic choral piece to date, and I was thinking about who would be the most epic MCs and producers within the hip hop genre today. And it started by me doing research with the local radio station 105.1 and Hot 97. And,
in New York.
In New York, to figure out who the public considered to be those artists. And then from that data, also I was creating this piece at the time, this is sort of around Shade Compositions too. And again, like I said, I was kind of emerging as a conductor or a composer. Yeah. So I wanted to kind of bring that into the work, and emceeing is a very gestural practice. And so I wanted to bring that performance into the video. So from the data I got from that survey, I collected videos of those artists and then motion tracked their hand movements. And from this library of hand movements, edited that to conduct Carmina Burana. But I didn't like the idea of it just being like this plus this equals art. I wanted to kind of marry them even more. So from the data, I took beat machine samples and sounds found in those artists' most successful music, and I would use those to remix Carmina Burana. Now, Carmina Burana is 6 movements that has several parts within it. So it would be quite long if I did the whole thing, but I decided to kind of like truncate it. So I have finished it. I'm happy to say 2 months ago, so it's like 9 years of work come to an end. So it's 6 videos, and each video is remixed, and I did the survey several times. Anytime I would do a movement, I would redo the survey, and the survey has happened, well, the piece has been created over several years, so when you watch the video now, you not only see kind of like the evolution of the hip-hop culture, you see the evolution of how it's presented too, because the aspect ratio changes, the videos become much more crisp and nicer in the newer movements. And I was also just interested in, when I transcribe the text, Carmina Burana is all about the fickleness of wealth. It's about partying, drinking, gambling, sex, and all the things that essentially popular hip-hop music is about. So I thought it was kind of interesting that they had so much in common. So again, it was about kind of putting those two seemingly opposite things together. And it came together quite well. I'm really happy with it. So
it's a fantastic work, actually. Yeah. I think we have time for one more question before Tracy comes on the scene. Is a mic? Can we have a mic over this side? Okay. Okay, no problem. I've been told that we're running out of time. So I'd like at this point to thank Rashaad for sharing his practice with us. And thank you for coming to join us today. Thank you very much.